Very much.
Thank you, Professor Guo, for your presentations on the Chinese perspective of the regional order, and particularly its desire for a multipolar order as a shared with India. Now we have heard two distinguished speakers, one on the international legal order and the other one on the political order. Now the floor is open to the audience. We are up to about 12 o'clock, or even before that, since we started quite late. Now, can you please identify yourself and then pose a question? So there are mics around here. Please use the mics, please. This one here.
Thank you. First of all, I like to say that the two presentations were excellent. But, now, I mean, there are several ways that ASEAN and India and China can interact. My name is Nathan. Actually, I'm from the managing director of EAS Strategic Advice and also senior fellow of Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Now, there are a lot of platforms for China and India to interact at the multilateral level, at the regional level, and also at the bilateral level. But my own assessment is that I see more engagement of China and India at the regional level. And here, that's why I want to pick up the point of Professor Gao in the sense that there is actually a good platform to work on, because if you look at what Senior Minister Goh has mentioned, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is one area that I think India and China can come together. Another, of course, will be the ASEAN Regional Forum, where you can look at discussing some of the issues. But in your own sense, what do you think is the best approach or best model for India-China cooperation, given the dynamics that you have mentioned, as well as the institutional and the historical aspects of it? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll take one more question, then I'll... Yes? Gentleman there.
Okay, I'm from Liang. I got two questions for the two speakers. Okay, first is for the first speaker, for Mr. Sonara. Could you comment on the binding power of current international law as with reference to new multipolar legal order? Okay, in the sense, like for example, in conflict management, like in the East China Sea or even South China Sea, especially the Japan-China dispute. Okay, why I bring this out because whether so far there are so many dialogue sessions between China and Japan, but in conflict management, like effective conflict management, what I propose is that short-term management is UN Security Council members form a joint Navy force from the Security Council members nation, and temporarily both sides should let the UN Security Navy patrol that Diaoyu Island. Okay, so long-term solution I observe already in place, but in the interest of time I will not review this. So what is your view on the binding power of current international law in effective conflict management in solving disputes? This is my first question for the first speaker. For the second speaker, for the okay, I think Dr. Kuo actually identified the trend that lack of mutual trust between China, big powers, and also the Japan or even the ASEAN nations because of this international border dispute over the islands. Okay. So what should be some effective political platform that could be, let's say, can be effective in resolving disputes? Because what I see that if the bilateral relation between China and Japan is at all-time low, and the fact that the trade relation between the two countries also been greatly affected. And what should be would you like to suggest any effective political platform? Because you mentioned about East Asia Summit, ASEAN +2 +3, so many dialogue sessions. But in resolving dispute, it really lacked the mechanism to effectively resolve dispute in the shortest possible time. So is there any better way, any better platform for dispute to be resolved in the shortest possible time? Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Kuo. First, I think the first question and last question is quite similar. In other words, the question is, how could India and China work together? What mechanism you can think of that they can actually find a greater common interest and therefore more converging of the strategic interest between China and India? What's your suggestion? And then we'll pass on to you.
Yeah. I just mentioned that, gives a policy recommendation that China and India, we have a large space for building CDMs. Since which China and India, first is psychologically, I think it's easier to communicate. As I always talk with my Indian friends, so it's easier to understand each other because we have shared a similar history. This way we understand each other easily. The Indian professor can understand, people can understand why China opened our door. We have the role. China is a model for our Indian development. You can hear many voices there. China have a lot for India to learn. But on the other hand, we can find that when we talk about the Indian-China relations, we still also China share the view that India is doing a similar posture, is that both China and India want to have a multipolar world. India want to have a big voice in Asia as also in the world platform. China has shared the same. So this is the basis for China. Not only I would want to mention more because we are talking more economic cooperation, we need more economic fields, CBMs, but in the political and security level, we have a lot. For example, I mentioned China and India have this intention to build a strategic security dialogue. This is a strategic security dialogue. We need to understand each other over the Indian Ocean, we talk about Malacca, South China Sea. All these we share because our national interests we merge or we share along these sea lanes. So how we build trust, understand Chinese intention and our Indian intention in South China Sea, Chinese intention in Indian Ocean. So we need more. I think we have more, I think, bilaterally. On the international level, I think ASEAN can play the important role between China and India. I don't think the time is right. I want to talk about China-Japan, the dispute. With regard to the question about China-Japan disputes over Diaoyu Island, and also how we think about the international law. And from my point of view, I'm not a professor of international law, actually. I'm a professor of international relations. But from my understanding, as I mentioned, China has to take the policy of no first, provocative action. China never do this first. I think that's similar to what I think as Japan and Philippines against China and do against India. I think China do not do the stupid, policy towards India. Want to make the China-Indian border disputes to be a big crisis. China has no intention. So that's why I think if I look at the present situation for China and Japan, any policy alternative, I think it should be under the history, under the international framework after the World War II. We understand that China is China caused a half colonialized country before the 1949. So when China, that's why India, I think, understand Chinese position when we have the dispute with India, with Japan, because China lost so many lands in the last 100 years before the 1949. China has had the idea of how the sovereignty is so important for our rising powers. This is India have the same, share the same. So I think for China-Japan relations in the future, the Japan should be understand more about Chinese history and share the views with China. That makes China-Japan relations even more stable. Otherwise, will be more crisis.
Prof, at least more the extension of the first question. The question is, how could China and India work together to shape the new international legal order to prevent conflicts from arising, such in South China Sea?
Well, I will confine my comments to the South China Sea. The United Nations is virtually useless here, and the suggestion of any action through the United Nations would not be appropriate simply because of the fact that China is a member of the Security Council, has a right of veto, and any effort on the part of the United Nations would be stymied by the exercise of a veto by China if the solution is something which does not cause comfort to China. The second solution, of course, is whether it can be solved through arbitration or through submission of the dispute to the International Court of Justice. I think that is the way that Singapore solved its problems with Malaysia, and Malaysia solved its problems with Indonesia. But here again, it's very unlikely that China would seek to have this dispute resolved through litigation before the International Court of Justice. The third idea, of course, is that there should be common development of the resources if the conflict is a resource-based conflict. The long-term time assumption is that somehow there's going to be a lot of oil around the South China Sea and the dispute is about the oil. But that does not appear to be so. So the notion of joint development by the different disputants in the South China Sea area is not also a feasible idea, despite the fact that it is an idea that that many in Singapore have put forward as a solution. The outside interest, of course, our outside intervention is resented by China, particularly the presence of the United States in the discussion of South China Sea. The United States' interest can only be in relation to the freedom of transit through the South China Sea, and of course, as long as this is guaranteed, neither China nor India should have concern with the South China Sea, at least as far as international law is concerned, because that would seem to be the only interest that is feasible in terms of international law to third parties to the area, that they must have a freedom of transit. The problem is complicated, of course, by assertions of sovereignty. In the sense, as my colleague pointed out, China fervently believes that the 9 dotted lines which enclose much of the South China Seas are based upon entirely legal principles. And the funny thing, of course, is that China draws these legal principles entirely upon the basis of an international law that is constructed by Europe on the basis of discovery by Admiral Cheng Ho, and then down through history, the idea that Chinese fishermen and others have used these islands from historical times. So here we find a sort of an interesting reversion on the part of China to the Eurocentric international law that I pointed out earlier. The problem, I think, is going to remain with us for a long period of time. We see ASEAN, a certain discord arising within ASEAN on this subject. But as China rises in power, the vigor of the Chinese assertion of its claims to South China Sea can be expected to increase. As to whether there would be any legal solutions to it, as I said, the legal solutions that seem to exist don't provide too much of an avenue. Thank you.
Thank you. Offer the floor. Yes, the gentleman there. And then Kantia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Sabeshan. On the question for the first speaker, based on international law, will you be able to share some legal perspectives over the current Sino-Indian border dispute? And as for the second speaker, there has been some understanding between China and India over cooperation in the area of energy. But despite that, there have been some cases of Chinese companies undercutting Indian companies, especially in oil exploration in Africa. And on the political front, China has yet to concretely put its weight behind India's desire for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. So my question to you is, under what context can there be real, truthful cooperation between China and India? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's quite similar to the previous question. Anyway, Kanti, yes.
Kanti Bajpai from the LKY school at NUS. This is a question on Asian security and the possibility of India-China cooperation in a larger regional organization sometime in the future. And I draw my question from the observation that India and China are the only two countries that are members of several sub-regional organizations in one form or the other, and therefore form the core of a possible Asian security system. So India and China meet with Russia in that trilateral. They meet in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where India is an observer member. China, of course, is a full and leading member there. India, in a sense, repays the favor with China as an observer member in the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, where, of course, India is a leading member. They're both part of the ASEAN plus institutions, ARF, ADMM plus, and so on. They're also both members of the East Asian Summit. Possibly in the future, as China's move towards the Indian Ocean almost inevitably occurs, there may be the question of Chinese membership in some fashion or the other in Indian Ocean regional cooperation as well. So you have two of the giants, as it happens, increasingly members in all these organizations, and they're the only two that have that. Do you, as both speakers, do you think there's some possibility or even desirability to use this as the basis for a larger Asian architecture with India and China, and of course the United States, because whether anybody likes it or not, the United States is an Asian power. Whether India and China should and could form the basis of a larger regional organization and take the lead there, would that be a good thing or not?
Yeah, I think I'll pass on to Professor Guo. Yeah, the question is whether these duplications of security institutions, would it help to promote greater stability? Could India and China work something new, a mechanism which can combine all into one, which is far beyond what is being conceived here?
Just I mentioned the Indian desire for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Think about China's foreign policy regards the Asian permanent seat. Only one now in Asia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Okay, if we have to choose another one, do we choose Japan or India? If we have a choice between India and Japan, who we will choose? Who will be the first number one? So India, of course, from Chinese perspective, particularly when China has a very serious crisis with Japan. So that's why I suggest, even in my presentation, that I do have an idea as the second question about the broad view of China-Indian cooperation, not only in economic field, but also in security field. We should have more dialogue. As China-US relations, we can find that in President George W. Bush era, we have China-US strategic dialogue. And also we have another one is China-US strategic economic dialogue. Now we merge them together as SED, China-US SED talk. So why China and India, why we should not have more talks, not only in the economic field? So I think it's a good time for China and India to talk strategically first about how we understand our security fields, how we understand our national interest, the core national interest in between us. We need more communication, and then more communications, more understanding. I think will be we can avoid more the mistrust. I think this is my Talk about the SEO. I'm very interested in this topic. The SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India is now an observer of the SCO, and China also is an observer of the South Asian, the Security Association. So I think this is also the topic under this framework, under this China-India security dialogue. If we have the desire to build, I think it depends on our diplomatic desire, diplomatic decision-making process. I think that's it. Yeah.
Prof, I add to that because I mentioned just now that in the 50s, both China and India have really played a very great moral influence on the third world through the Panchu spirit and the Bantu spirit. Could this be revived? Things have changed so much that these two Russian powers can play a similar role?
Yeah, I would very much think that it could be done. The Chinese always talk about harmony under the heavens as a prelude to all the statements that they make. And I believe that comes from historical and cultural ideas of the Chinese people. And there is a resonance of that on the Indian side as well. The Bandung Conference and peaceful coexistence. In fact, there is a treaty in 1952 between China and India relating to how they should conduct their affairs in Tibet, relating to the idea of peaceful coexistence, specifying all the principles of coexistence in a legal manner. So there is a possibility of the revival of this, and you would find it articulated best in, I think, the New Delhi Declaration of BRICS, where there is a lot of statements relating to the need for cooperation. And BRICS, I feel, is driven by China and India to a large extent. There will be other areas of cooperation besides the one which Kanti mentioned. There is the hope that there would be a new free trade agreement made between ASEAN, China and India that would have an area and a population that is far in excess of the Trans-Pacific Treaty that the United States has proposed. So this would create a market that is much larger. A short note on the border dispute. I mean, the border dispute is going to be there, but I think its significance would come to be reduced in time to come. And there is not much hot air about the border dispute in recent times. So one would hope that it would go away. But the border dispute is probably one area which the lawyer is greatly interested in, because the Indian argument is very clearly stated, and the Chinese state it in the form of an assertion of a doctrine that is enunciated by the Chinese on their own, the notion of an unequal treaty. The idea being that the McMahon line between China and India was drawn in historical times when China was not a major power.
Thank you, Prof. I'm conscious that there are several questions from the floor I wanted to ask, but we have run out of time now, so I think we have to break the sessions, and then we'll continue the session which is focused on economic, and hopefully those questions which a student would like to answer can perhaps delay those questions until their time. And also I'm conscious that both our excellent speakers have given very comprehensive, very stimulating answers to the questions what you have in your mind. And on this, I would like to invite you to show appreciation to our two very distinguished speakers.